Hi, welcome back to LaidOPEN Podcast. I'm your host, Charna Cassell, and today's guest is Rachel Kaplan. She's somebody I went to grad school with, and so I've known her for quite a long time. She's also the host of the Healing Feeling Shit Show podcast, as well as the author of Heal, Feel, and Let That Shit Go. We're going to have a conversation today about feeling, the process of feeling, the importance of feeling, and all the ways that people who struggle to feel themselves and express themselves and move emotion through their bodies can do that, can learn to do that. And she's really funny and sassy, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Hi, Rachel. Welcome.
Learn how to live embodied. Your life is about to unwind. Uncover new tools and start healing. Leave trauma and tension behind. Isn't it great, laid open? Let all your desires come true. How can you live laid open? Imagine yourself brand new. Imagine yourself brand new.
Good to see you.
It's so good to see you and be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I've already mentioned to our listeners that we went to grad school together. So we have a long history. And it's really exciting for me to be seeing where you're at and, first with the podcast, but that now with this book, and that you've birthed it into the world and it's going to be available soon. When will it actually be in stores for people?
It's purchasable right now, whenever
Mhm.
this is, like right today when we're recording, and it will be fully launched in the world on October 15th, 2024, in case you're in the future.
Yes. In case you're a time machine and you've traveled into the
We're in the past in 2024. Yeah, and just briefly, I'll say it's so great to be with you. And I feel like first of all, I feel like the one class I really remember us sharing, which was couples therapy, that I felt like we were these two very bright lights in the class. And I remember being drawn to you and inspired by you. And I know we have neighboring birthdays. And this isn't the first time we've, collaborated. We've talked a lot about podcasts. And I know your podcast vision started with book intentions. And so, I'm just honored you're having me on your show and that you have such a rich and beautiful show. And I'm excited to talk to you. I really respect you. I also had you on my podcast on a team of people, and I spent a lot of time just saying how much I wished you were my therapist then. Do you remember?
I do.
And I meant it. I
Aw.
sent you clients. I think I'm very picky about therapists. I think there's a lot of bad therapy, and I think you are a very good therapist.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I was already recommending your book to a client the other day. I have a range of clients. Some are big feelers and others who can't feel. And I feel like this book is useful for everybody. It's a pretty universal book. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Uh-huh. So what's the feeling movement about?
I love that. Way to start there. It has this dual meaning. And on one hand, if you don't know already, the metaphor I like to teach people about their feelings and how to work with their feelings is poop. I call my modality or my method emotional potty training. So on one hand, the movement is a bowel movement, but in a much deeper, more meaningful way, the movement is this revolution of people relearning how to feel and reclaiming the full access to our emotional, deeply sensing, feeling, emoting humanity. And that, as a culture, in our little mini cultures, our family cultures, we've all been, even by the best intentioned caregivers, kind of shifted out or conditioned out of our emotions, our full expression of emotions. And certainly our current time, very busy, very economic culture is trying to monetize our desire to avoid our pain, and gives us infinite options and distractions as alternatives to just feeling our pain and our emotions. And so I'm saying no, guys, that actually brings more pain. Let's all learn to feel really skillfully so we can just be who we are. And it feels revolutionary to me.
Yeah. When I started doing somatic therapy and learning about embodiment, I was like, this is radical. This is like a form of activism to like actually
Yeah.
be embodied and be able to feel yourself after being so dissociated. So I hear you
Yeah.
saying a very similar thing. Right. So
Yeah.
let's get radical together.
Yeah. Let's do it.
So what do you see is at stake if people don't feel their feelings? And then how does that impact all aspects of their life?
Yeah, well, I feel like listeners might just tune into, think about when you've tried to avoid yourself. I mean, basically, even though there is like a deadening of feeling or a numbing of feeling. So by the time you've been avoiding your feelings for a certain amount of decades, there is some part of it that will operate on autopilot. So it's not like every moment you're choosing necessarily to abandon your body, but at the most basic level, there's not a home that we get to live in. If we don't want to feel anything, we have to figure out a way to not be in our nervous systems, in our bodies. And there are, myriad of options for that, like substances. I like to call our alternatives to feeling our drugs of choice or our
Mhm.
drug of choice. Most people have a few. So it could be anything from intense busyness, addiction to entertainment, whether it's Netflix or the news. It certainly could be substances, drinking, smoking, ketamining all the time, even, you could be, for some of your people, maybe like medicine ceremonies. Maybe you're addicted to the intensity of a medicine ceremony or just trying to get somewhere. Even being a really good mom or a really successful business person could all be used as an alternative to feeling our insecurity or our terror of our mortality or our terror of our, whether or not we're lovable, feeling our grief, our heartbreak. What I find is at stake is that all of those methods are destructive. It costs you your physical health, it costs you your relational health. It's hard to have a healthy relationship and be empathic toward a partner if you're not willing to feel your pain. It's hard to make time for a partner or your kids if you need to stay ramped up at level 10 in order to avoid your pain. So there's no way, and it just doesn't work. I think we all know, if you're listening to this and you've tried it, you probably know that it didn't work that long. It's like, I joke and I reveal in the book, my drug of choice is clothing. It's like once you have the new sparkly, perfect new piece, it's not like you're going back to that piece. It's like you always need to feed the beast to keep those service level distractions active. And still what it leads to is this deep down, pretty suspicious feeling of like, imposter. I'm not enough. If someone gets close to me, they're going to uncover this. So even if you have the steady drip of your favorite alternative to your human emotional experience, you'll be living in fear that you're full of it, and you are. And it's not a problem. Like, you don't have to feel bad about it. You got there honestly, but the way to not be full of it is to learn how to let it, and that being your pain and all that backlog of unprocessed stuff, kind of slowly, one feeling at a time, clear your system and be felt and allowed and therefore moved.
What's interesting about that, we both share a love of clothing. I'm in my closet right now, and I'm going to just tilt you towards my.
Yeah.
I remember being a teenager, and I had PTSD even as a teenager. And my drugs of choice were art, making art, music, and clothing, like reading books and going to vintage clothing stores. And I can track the same feeling of like kind of like sinking in, and there's a level of like hyper focus but kind of fuzzing out, and like what I imagine for somebody else is like taking a drug, but just like this feeling in my body that only years later, reading a really good book and when I was in an embodied place, could I go, oh my God, that's what I used to feel. right? That was the escape that it offered. It was just
Relief,
like
sounds
momentary.
like.
Exactly. And I think what's important here is like there can be levels because you might be someone who feels things very intensely. You may not even realize that you're dissociating, but that you're getting some relief. Like it's taking a little bit off the top. It's softening things
Absolutely.
because your system is in so much panic all the time. And then while on the other side, there are people who are just so numb,
Right.
they can't feel themselves when their hand or somebody else's hand is on their body.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, your drugs of choice, I mean, I liked hearing how you experienced it. And those are actually, I think, fairly helpful, music and making art. I'm like, way to go. I mean, I feel like the thing I'm addicted to that's the healthiest is exercise.
Mhm.
And I think I'm grateful for that one, but it makes sense that while you were fuzzing out or getting relief and also checking out, that those were also probably ways that you were really nourishing
Resourcing.
yourself. Yeah.
Mhm.
And those are actually ways I suggest as far as increasing your bandwidth for feeling, so good job.
Well, there's some others that are important, right? And they've done studies around what helps people avoid PTSD over time. There's certain kinds of resources, and you mention a bunch in terms of increasing bandwidth. Do you want to say the rest of those?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest one or some of the biggest ones are nature, like feeling connected to something bigger than you. And, nature was something that I have a mentor who was instrumental in my healing and the biggest influence on my understanding. He prefers to be anonymous. He's not a therapist. He was like a mud hat earth person who was initiated into an Apache lineage, but he's very private and he doesn't believe in the internet. And I'm like, I'm one of them. So anyway, he really helped me. And this was in the last, I stopped working with him about 8 years ago, but for 4 or 5 years, he really helped me reclaim my connection to the earth. And from his perspective, our disconnection to the earth is so much a part of our illness. But so it might sound like a weird kind of, okay, you want me to go on a hike? And it's deeper than that. It's like, and it doesn't have to be far off and huge. And it doesn't have to be the most fantastic place in nature you can find, but it's what is it like to feel like you belong? And so much of, though it's invisible in our lives in a way with, grocery stores and Uber Eats and, DoorDash, we don't realize how much we're totally dependent on the animals and the plants and trees that have been turned into our homes and shelter. So there is a way that I think our divorcedness from our source in that way is part of what keeps us ill. And so if there's a tree near your house or if you are growing herbs even on your windowsill, or if there's moving water, just something you can create a relationship to by visiting again and again. And that just to feel like you're in connection to the natural world, we have to slow down. So that's a huge one. And it wasn't an obvious one for me. I think as urban people, it can feel overwhelming and kind of like woo woo to try to be like, oh, earth is going to help me with my feelings or my trauma. But yes. And then a few others is just, and this kind of depends a lot of when Charna's referencing my use of the word bandwidth. I like to think about, if you hadn't pooped for 30 years, you have a pretty big log in there, right? And you're going to need laxatives, you're going to need patience. My favorite metaphor is to say that, if you went to the airport and you forgot to download a movie onto your device, you want one on your iPad, let's say, no matter how long you spend at the airport, you could have 8 hours and you still probably wouldn't get that movie onto your device. And the reason is that free airport Wi-Fi is really weak signal. And so when you have something big and you need to move it through, it needs a strong signal. And so, as a therapist, I feel like I am a Wi-Fi hotspot. I'm sure you are too, where we're amplifying people's bandwidth so that they can create a connection strong enough to the parts of them that are in pain in order to allow these big, untouched, scary feelings to come through. And so what you want to look for is these are all, how can you amplify your bandwidth? So music that has the tone of the emotion that you're trying to connect to, whether it's angry or sad or just weird and frenetic, could help. If you cannot be a perfectionist and you want to make art, whether writing or visual art, that can help. I think anyone who's going to try to make it look perfect or be in judgment of what you're seeing, that will shut it down. I think one thing that might be useful for listeners is to look at what are the most common ways we try to amplify our bandwidth. And it's usually through humans. People have a hard experience. They pick up the phone, they call a friend and they vent, or you can't cry about something until someone you love is listening. And that's really beautiful. My first editor made the joke that all of my suggestions make it sound like I hate friendship. And it's partially because my mentor, the deepest influence, was someone who is so much about this sovereign capacity to be able to do it for yourself, but meaning like to not overlean on someone. Because the equivalent, if we're going to say that feeling our feelings is a little like pooping our poop, it's like, do you want to have to invite someone you love into the bathroom every time you need to have your feelings? Or do you want to save that for the special occasions when you have a really hard feeling and you're mostly going to try to at least know that you can use these tools, whether it's your local tree or your sad playlist or getting in a bathtub and being swaddled by the water. These are all ways that you can kind of amplify your sense of connection and containment and bandwidth and try to allow yourself to just feel as much pain as you're in.
Right. Well, the funny thing about, we don't want as therapists, you don't want people to only be able to connect to themselves when they, exactly, when they're in session. You want to give people tools, ideally, as much as we love them, to move along, little doggy,
Absolutely.
so that there's co-regulation and self-regulation, and there's and regulation doesn't just mean calm down, don't feel. It means be regulated enough to be with your feelings.
Exactly.
And know that you're not going to die, or someone else isn't going to die.
Yeah, absolutely. And that we can co-regulate with things other than other people. And your therapist is probably the most healthy person to co-regulate or to learn about co-regulation with. But yeah, we can get input from things beyond humans. I think that's true. I mean, do you?
Totally. I mean, I also had a teacher who was from West Africa. And so, one of the practices that I find very useful that he taught me is having a reciprocal relationship with everything around you. It could be a lamppost, but trees. I remember even sitting in a sauna and having a conversation with the water that was misting on me, and it's like, what do you have for me? What do you need from me? And being in that conversation. I was in my garden right before coming in here and picking Armenian cucumbers and tomatoes. And, I think the thing that even a garden has to offer you is a reminder of cycles of life. Like things die, things like being able to be with the disappointment of like, oh, what did I do? Did I under fertilize? Did I hang something that needs to crawl and be crowded over, an archway? Like, well, how can I relate to this being differently and know that each of these things needs something different? And then that gives you permission to realize, wow, maybe I had in my family, and my family didn't have the capacity to give that to me, but like, how do I give that to me and have it be okay that I need something different? So I think there's
absolutely
so much that you can learn through nature. Yeah.
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 Yeah. My mentor would talk about, that you don't see animals feeling bad for themselves, or just like dwelling in some of their negative states. It's like, or if you think about, people talk a lot about completing the stress cycle of an animal running from a predator. It's like, once it's safe, maybe it shakes it off, right? And moves along, right? And so, yeah, there is a lot that we can learn, and it can feel sometimes, I think, out of our reach, for people who are in cities and don't have that organic, natural connection. And, I think for me, I learned to build it, and it took a long time to feel like I belong to the earth. And I think it's a huge part of my wellness. And so, it's never too late to start to be like, well, what does that mean for me? And how can I feel more supported and held?
Yeah. Well, and so there's, you're referring to something that it's like the biggest entity. There's the cosmos, there's the earth, there's like, and you get closer in, and then you look at, okay, so what about me? There's so many disowned, as you talk about in your book, disowned parts, like parts that we make wrong or bad inside of ourselves. And so, the process of befriending and reparenting is one of the things you talk about. Do you want to get into that some?
Sure. Yeah. So, what I call this work is emotional potty training. And it really is this two-prong focus or two-wing focus, two-phase focus. And, this work of what we'll talk about, parts work, it's, I didn't start it. Neither did IFS, by the way.
Yeah.
It's very old. I mean, you see it in some of the most original forms of therapy and, in spiritual, archetypes and mythology. I really deeply immersed myself in parts work via Gestalt therapy, which was my initial foundational training. But the first wing of this approach is really about reintegrating these parts of us. Because if you're like, all right, I heard this episode, I've heard Charna, now I hear Rachel. Okay, I'm going to have my feelings. I'm going to try this out. If you don't have a connection, or if the parts of you that are in the most pain are locked up, and I'll talk about how I perceive that happening, you won't have access to the pain that needs to move, right? And so before we can really, which doesn't mean you don't have any pain, but it's like, like what this book is really about is teaching people, how do you heal the deepest wounds inside, the parts that the parts that are wondering, do they deserve love? Do they belong? Are they okay? And for most of us, because that's what I'd love to see is people the subtitle is, lasting self-love and emotional resilience. And the emotional resilience is like, you know how to feel all your feelings. You've become integrated enough and skillful enough that you can handle your life and any hard feeling that's going to come and surprise it. Even once you're at that place, you're going to have hard feelings. I'm going to, you're going to,
Mhm.
just like we're going to keep pooping until we die, But the self-love part, lasting self-love is really about this integration process. So to understand it, it goes back to something I'm sure you've heard about on this show, which, is the industry word for it is like attachment. It's funny, my brain is a little bit taxed after this day I've had, but yeah, the importance of our core attachments. So when we come into this world as tiny little infants, we're incredibly sensitive. We don't have the capacity to think. We don't have, the capacity to speak. We're like little nervous systems, and we're little animals who are wired to know from a biological survival based level that if we don't stay close to our caregivers, we will die. And it's true. Like, you needed food and water and shelter and protection, and you won't have that if you don't have some basic level of parenting. And of course, it goes way deeper as far as the child's needs for attunement and care. Because we know we need this more than anything else, we're essentially wired before we can even think or before we understand what's happening to relate to our caregivers and our parents in ways that are comfortable for them, that keeps them close. So if you notice that your mom glasses over every time you cry, if once you grow a little bit, you start getting conditioning like, don't talk like that, or why are you so loud, or, sit still, or I'll give you something to cry about. These are all, painful ways that you're being shaped and you are invested and motivated to not express the aspects of yourself and qualities of yourself that would make your parents be harsh, move away, not love you. And it feels like life or death, like you said. Now, my favorite thing, I don't remember exactly when I learned it, but I do think this seed was planted in grad school. But to me, this, one simple choice point of being little explains why everyone's walking around feeling like they're the problem. And it is this. So when that's happening, when you're, whether by the most well-intended benevolent parent or by a more, abusive, neglectful parent, when you're being caused harm in your early life, you essentially have two ways to understand it. And let's remember, we don't really have sophisticated systems of understanding, right? But we can basically be like, me, good and innocent. I'm helpless. This isn't my fault. I'm a little cute little baby. And these people who I depend on for my survival are causing me harm. That's one like reality a child could sit with. And everyone just take a breath and imagine that being totally dependent and recognizing you're innocent in an unsafe world, right? That's like heavy, scary. The other option is you could be like, I must be bad. And maybe if I do better, if I'm less emotional, if I clean up my room, if I walk and talk the way my father wants me to, then I'll get the love and I'll be okay. And in that option, we have this sense of agency and control. And even as children, I think that is a safer alternative. And so for everyone walking around wondering, why do I feel when I'm so successful, I've got this sparkly, thriving life on the outside. Everyone in my life thinks I'm crushing it or killing it or I'm so great. And yet I'm walking around feeling like all of that is a cover up and deep down, I'm not good enough. Or if people knew me, they'd know that I'm too much or not enough, whatever version, whatever flavor you put on it based on your conditioning, it's incredibly normal. It's like that, that's how it happened. And as far as looking at, well, what happened after that, for all of us, we generally wanted to push away that experience. And so I use the metaphor of saying you walked it down and locked it into an emotional basement closet, but you're now operating, and by the time, just so you know, by the time you get to middle school and high school, you're getting all these other forms of conditioning. And of course, today's children, they're dealing with social media, right? There's like endless conditioning that we get of what makes us good or likable or attractive versus bad, unacceptable. And so by the time you're listening to a podcast like Charna's or you're picking up a book like mine, not only did these parents or caregivers and all of these like early childhood conditions impact you and condition you out of being yourself, but you have been locking your parts up in the basement closet, trying to not express those, being afraid that they'll show up probably for decades. And I think that's an important thing so that we get that we have the power actually. And that as we start this reintegration process and invite these parts back out, that we need to move really gently and with a lot of intention because most of us have lost their trust. It's like we've been telling ourselves, no, don't show that aspect to a potential partner. They'll leave you, or don't act like that at work. They won't trust you. And so, as we start to do the reintegration work, and I talk a lot about this in my book, like what does that look like? It starts with it's one of the very few places in my work I suggest to think. So it's like starts with like reflecting, like what did you feel made you unlovable? What was your perception of like what was, the scapegoated parts or what you had to hide? Just so you know who you're looking for, right? You don't want to have too fancy of an idea about it. It's much better to kind of be curious and see what's in there. But it is useful to know, okay, it's my emotionality, or maybe it was my sensuality. Like for me, that was a huge thing. Like I figured out a way to self-soothe while I was in a crib still. I basically figured out I called it tickling myself. And it was my favorite thing to do. And by the time I was 7, I was horrifically ashamed and didn't want anyone to mention my childhood, which is funny because I was clearly still a child, but like my super ego came online and I was like, oh God, I've been tickling myself. And if you don't know what I'm talking about self-pleasuring. And the profound shame I had about that was like overwhelming, And so to bring these parts back into your experience where you have a chance to feel whole, feel like yourself, not feel like you're hiding something, it's really a relationship building process. And one thing to know is that like most of us don't hide our strengths, We're not hiding our academic prowess and our athletic ability. We're hiding the things that were teased or that were outliers. We're hiding the parts of us that made us feel like weirdos, right? And so what happens when you build a life without those parts is it's not usually very suited for who you actually are, whether it's like, moving at too fast a speed or surrounded by people who aren't really your people. And so the beautiful news as you start to get to know these parts and welcome them and allow them to come out and start to check in on how do they actually feel about your life and your friends and your pace, you start to actually become much more sensitive and embodied and capable, like you said about the garden, of knowing what you actually need and starting to create a life that actually works for you and your unique, quirky, awesome, weird self.
One of the things that I would add to that is I think that for a lot of people who have complex PTSD, things that are not weird, that are absolutely normal, like wanting to be cared for, having support, or having even just permission to be able to feel your feelings. If you grew up with a narcissistic parent, those are the things that you feel shame about, right? Like just the desire or need for to be held can be a massive conflict internally, and to the point where you don't even feel that desire. Like
Absolutely.
you're
Yeah.
so divorced from it, you don't even recognize it. I mean, there are certain things that
Right.
it took me so long to make contact with because I'd become so self-reliant or just like,
Yeah.
was like feeling lonely. I don't get that.
Yeah. Right.
Neglect is very useful during COVID times, right? So like you're able to spend endless time by yourself. And then the other thing is in terms of disowned parts, what I see a lot with my clients and with myself, as you said, like we're ever evolving beings. And no matter how good you are at feeling yourself, like I get migraines, right? I just had a
Mm.
5-day migraine.
Oh
That
my
is
God.
the worrier. Like that's one of my
Mm.
parts. My worrier, if I don't have time to turn towards a certain part of myself and cry, you better believe that a migraine, so which we call
Wow.
somatization, like it'll get physicalized in my body. And
Yeah.
so a lot of people are dealing with physical pain and it's
Right.
basically saying, "Hey, turn your attention towards me. I
Right.
need you to be present with me."
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, because our emotions are so physical, like
Mhm.
they're gonna find some pathway whether or not we allow them. I'm so sorry you had a 5-day migraine, and what a powerful, like, little, I don't know, bouncer you have there, like, or like, that's, you can't mess around, I guess. I would imagine that would keep you wanting to cry a little bit here and there.
Well, yeah, right, off-gassing. Well, I mean, but here's the thing is that if we keep and this goes back to what you were saying, like if you keep yourself too busy, if you don't have what you call, and I'd like to get more into this, but like emotional release dates with yourself, if you don't have some way of staying connected, whether it is that you're seeing a therapist, whether it is that you watch sad movies or see your friends or, like do yoga where you get to be still and internal, and even when you do that, like I exercise every day, but there are times when you get literally ahead of yourself
Right. Yeah.
and don't feel, right? And
Right.
so
Yeah.
not everybody somatizes in backlogs. That's my brilliant yet at times obviously frustrating body. And that's
Mm.
how it communicates with me. Spirit
Yeah.
communicates through pain often for me.
It's high stakes.
Yeah,
It's high stakes, you know?
right. You have
But
to stay honest with yourself. That's what it
yeah.
does. Is like you just can't get like some
Right.
people just can't get too far away from themselves. But your book is useful in that, like I even had a migraine while I was reading your book and like I sat with there's a chapter on shame,
Mhm.
right? And sitting with that and just breathing into I often will have a conversation with the whatever part of my body is hurting. I go into that part and I wait for it's like go into the center of the pain, but also like asking like what it's needing from me,
Mm.
right? So I think it's really useful as you're reading this book, like you might feel the emotions
Yeah.
as they're being described. And then it's an opportunity to go into that and to have
Right.
one of those part states with yourself.
Yeah, right, and I keep trying at the end of every chapter to be like, "Don't keep reading, go try it," but, people are gonna do what they're gonna do.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
yeah, well, so you said you wanted to talk about that part, right?
Well, the difference between, proactive and reactive,
Yeah, absolutely.
emotional release work, I think is useful.
Okay, well, so, now we're moving to the other wing of emotional potty training or the other, phase. My upcoming TEDx talk, he's like, "I don't wanna talk about it with wings, let's talk phases." I'm like, "Okay." There are wings in the book, but the reason I like the metaphor of wings is that a bird can only fly if it has 2 healthy wings, and so you really
Mhm.
both of these parts, like, having your feelings all the time without access to your authentic parts that are in pain is only gonna do you so much good, and having those parts on pain that are in pain back online, but not being willing to feel their pain or shutting down their pain is re-traumatizing for them. And there are so many, and I hope I did it justice in the book, so many subtle ways that we do talk ourselves out of our pain, with the best of intentions. And I'm trying to really help people learn how to not do that. But moving to the second wing is really about how do you feel the feelings so that you can release the pain that you're holding. And before I get into the difference between those two types of emotional feeling or feeling work, I'll just say that there's 2 levels this, emotional potty trained state works at. One is that, we uncover the core wounds that are in our emotional basement closet. And in a different way to say it is, if you felt like you were unlovable throughout your life, if you experienced a lot of trauma and you feel unsafe as a baseline, your resting state is lack of safety, or you're just constantly in rage, right? Or hating life. Like we get into these extreme negative states. And for a lot of us, that is our baseline, meaning if you're not distracting yourself, if nothing big and sparkly and exciting is happening, that's how you feel deep inside. And so part of this work is about going in, reclaiming these parts and letting them, helping them release their pain, and move from a really negative state to a more neutral state, so that one emotional release at a time, you're getting lighter and getting a little more toward, an emotional neutral. And it's not an emotional high. There's a whole chapter on this. I don't know if you read that.
Yeah.
A lot of us, what we're doing is we're in such a deep emotional negative that we're just pendulum swinging to the highs, which of course is, detrimental, and those are unstable and cause problems too. And then we just swing back to the lows. So this is much more about like these very pretty delightful states of like contentment, safety, worth that might not be so flashy, but they're very stable. They're very comfortable, and they're very ideal for building a life on them. And that's like the deep, slow core wound healing that happens through processing your feelings. And I'll describe what kind of feeling work leads to that. But the other side of becoming an emotionally potty trained grown up, which you'll do, while you're doing that deep healing work, but also after, kind of like the goal of this is not to make everyone obsessed with their emotional pain all the time. Like you'll hopefully get to a place where you feel fairly content with what you've integrated, and you might not be as focused as creating these proactive healing sessions, which I'm about to describe. But you will have the skills to know that when life or your day gets hard, let's say you have a fight with your partner or your boss or something happens, you know how to responsibly, appropriately move the feeling. And so this skill, we'll start there, is called reactive emotional release. And what it means is that something happened to you, so you allowing the feeling is a reactive process. And this is much easier for most people. That's actually how a lot of people know their feelings, is something they get kind of like kicked in the gut or kicked in the face, and they feel, or someone dumps them and they feel, or something acute happens and they feel. And, it's useful, right? There's a range of how appropriately people feel. Like some people, once they're having their feelings, they're going to spew it all over others, are going to create destruction or harm around them, or to themselves. So the reason why it's actually a form of emotional release work is learning how to do it in a way where it's safe for you, it's safe for people around you, learning techniques that will support you doing it depending on how much time you have. Like if you have to cry at your office building, you might need a different strategy. You might need to go into a bathroom and know how to like cry or shake if you're really scared about, giving a presentation. You might need to know how to quickly transform your state or release some energy that's happening in your body, or maybe take a walk around the block, right? So these are all ways that you're learning how to respond to yourself while you're already activated, and how to do it in a way that helps you recover. And there's a whole bunch of tools and skills and directives I give around how do you just actually bring your awareness into the pain? What are the steps of working with any feeling? And then, of course, depending on what the feeling is, you get a lot more help and very specific techniques for, because working with anger is completely opposite from working with sadness, right? You're going to need a different setup. Some of the premise is the same. You're giving permission, you're turning towards yourself, you're, feeling your body. But the energetics of actually releasing it or moving it are going to be different. And so you're going to get instruction on all parts of that through the book. So the deeper work that's required to actually heal the core wounds is something called proactive emotional release work. And that's when, and you referenced it about creating a feeling date, that's when, it's really useful to carve out a few times, I'd say 2 to 3 times at least, if you're really going to go for this, a week, where you're going to try to build up, anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour, I'd say, and that doesn't mean you're going to be trying to emote or squeeze out feelings. And by the way, we're never trying to exploit the feelings or force them, right? That would hurt as much as forcing a poop out and will shut you down, actually. But, you're not necessarily in active feeling that whole time, but you're in that process of slowing down and going in and giving permission. And this is where you have the chance to really track, like, what are the imbalances that you're focusing on? And so you might have a sense, you're not necessarily like going to be already triggered, because if you're already triggered in a feeling state, then now we're in the reactive work, right? You feel what's coming out already. This is when you might know, okay, I have a lot of terror and I have a lot of shame, and I'm going to see what's there. You always want to be with what's real and what's available to you versus your idea of what you're supposed to move that day. But you might have a plan of like, I really want to create a safe space to work with my fear today. And so you'd go in, you'd create some time, set it aside, put your phone away, slow down, turn toward the fear. Quick tip with fear. I'm sure this is familiar because you're in Sharna's world. You're in good hands. But you might ask, do I feel frenetic? Do I feel like I want to freak out and run and fight? Or do I feel frozen? Do I feel more collapsed and like I need the swaddling? And we can talk about the energetics of emotion, and the basic difference is in the way they move. But depending on what that would be, if you're working with fear, you might set yourself up differently. You might, put out, if you were frenetic, you might put on weird music and try to, erratically move and shake and jump. If you felt more frozen and like you needed to cry because you feel helpless and terrified, maybe you'd get in the bathtub or put on a weighted blanket and put on sad music and try to tune into the helplessness. So that intentional kind of setting aside time, the way you would go to a gym or the way you would go to yoga, is how you cultivate the practice and the skill, and how you realize how hard and awkward it is. And so you can start to troubleshoot specifically for you. But I think it's like without that deep practice and commitment to keep showing up for ourselves, it's hard to get past, kind of just like the emotional ride of the day for most people. Now, that being said, if you're in a state where you're really suffering or struggling, or you're feeling traumatized, you're feeling like you're not really functioning, I would say that isn't a moment you want to be doing that deep dive. You really want to just be using all your resources and skills to resource yourself, to make sure that you feel safe, that you're well fed, that you're sleeping, that you're taking whatever downtime you need, like kind of nervous system regulation. And for sure, feeling your feelings through if you're going through something hard, so you don't get flooded or overwhelmed or numb or go into addiction, all of that. But I wouldn't go digging for your core wounds from childhood. Like, you got enough going on. And that might be tricky. Like, someone might always feel like they don't have space to do the deeper work. And, there's nothing wrong with that, but you might want to check on a thought like that if that's actually just a fear of moving toward these more young or vulnerable parts of you. And what I'll say in conclusion of this epic monologue is that, that once you taste like the relief that can come from one of these sessions, like until you taste that, until you see for yourself, not taking either of our words for it, that having a little bit of your pain actually brings more peace, or you feel lighter, or you feel more functional, or you feel proud of yourself after sitting with something as big and scary and painful as shame. Like, until you taste that, it's very hard to do this work. You might, I try to be really inspiring and give you all the good juju, but you really have to have that first experience for yourself. And then once that's in place, it's very self-motivating because you like feel better.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, you've touched on a lot of things in your epic monologue, but in terms of how to build enough safety internally, how to build enough resilience and self-trust. And it's like, before you have that first experience, especially doing it by yourself, like maybe you have an emotional release in the presence of a therapist and you have the holding and it's terrifying, yet there's someone else there. And it's not often until you can move through something like that and feel that space of peace that you're describing and realize that you weren't destroyed by it. Right. They've done studies, right, where it's like somebody will spend their whole life avoiding an emotion that if they actually let themselves move into it, it's like, okay, it's processed in 20 minutes. Yeah. It doesn't mean it's gone forever. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It doesn't mean it's gone forever. It will return. But I think the more that you go into your feelings, you realize that nobody else is going to be totally obliterated. Because that's, I think, the big fear, especially if you have an emotionally avoidant parent where you're like they're going to, not only will they not love me, but they may die if I feel this fear or grief. Right.
They may die and I might die because they'll abandon me. And when we were tiny babies, those were, good thoughts to have.
Yeah. Yeah. one of the things that you talk about, which I think is important, right? It's like feel the feelings and then reality check,
Yeah.
right? And so,
absolutely.
right, that piece of like, yeah, you're not a baby anymore. Let's check it
Right.
out. Is anybody
Yeah.
gonna go?
The
Yeah.
aftermath of feeling. And, it's really important, and the book explains this, that it is the aftermath. I mean, sometimes you need to do it before a really big, scary feeling also. But a lot of people do it as soon as the feeling starts coming online, and just, that will shut down your feeling
Mhm.
when you have the access to the feeling. Why am I feeling this is just shooting on yourself. It's bringing yourself back into your intellect. And so reality testing and aftercare, or self-care after you have a big feeling release, is so crucial, but it's good to not do it instead of the feeling. Or else it's like stitching up like a cut that has a bunch of dirt and gravel in it where it's going to get infected. So you feel first, you feel how true the feelings feel first. And there's help with that step, and then
Mhm.
do the
Mhm.
kind of, now is it actually true?
And so what do you say to your clients who do come and they don't feel safe yet? They don't feel resilient. They don't trust their capacity.
Yeah. I mean, well, one of the things that I trust when someone comes in that state is they're only going to get access to so much. Meaning, like, I have found that it's the rare person that is that terrified of their feelings that is going to be flooded. Most of the time when someone is, and I know that they do exist, but I find that most people, and I'm curious your stance, since you're so much focused on the trauma and PTSD side, most of the time people are more going to struggle with numbness than flooding. What do you think?
You know what? This is a tricky question, Rachel, because I think we often attract, like attracts like. And
Uh-huh.
so I have had a number of clients over the years whose systems, my hands have to be on their physical body to start to help them feel themselves. And how quickly people go into hypoarousal tells me a lot about their level of numbness. So, like, if they start to get really drowsy and kind of go flaccid, if we're starting to do breath work or feel feelings, then I know that it's like we need to be with an emotion for a minute. It's like little tiny homeopathic
Yeah,
dosages, right?
absolutely.
But I actually, because my system is a huge feeling system, I've attracted a lot of big feelers. And because of PTSD, like because I work with so much of that, I have worked with a lot of people they're already flooded without, like their state
Doing
might be,
anything.
they're out of
Right.
their, as I call the window of capacity to be with. And it's like they're out of their window. So, it's very different strategies, physical containment, breath, and practices to bring someone back into their window if they're a big feeler, or waking up,
Right.
the body practices if they're more numb. And then catching those moments, right? This, right? Like people get away from their feelings. It's like it comes up and then whoop, the muscles like
Yeah.
squeeze it back down.
Right. And I do think that's why I bring up like the not thinking or trying to reality test or not asking the question why, because those are all surefire ways to get you out of the feeling. Whereas, it'd be like mid poop being like, I don't want to do this, like if you can stay with it, and I also trusting that whatever little bit, I'd say, to answer your question, when
Mhm.
someone doesn't have that, I mean, I trust that, if they're terrified and they're not having a lot of feelings, and they're, confused about this, that they're most likely going to get the smaller taste. Like, people will come back and report on they were able to stay with it for a minute. And so, I do rely on that. And I rely on, luckily the season 1 of my podcast has been, teaching people in the YouTube video. So it's like I'm doing a lot of like really trying to scaffold and teach them. And then in the session, really be with them and model it and like help them kind of work it, and then help them understand how they could do it for themselves.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think the work can be a little bit stop and start until someone has a taste of the relief that comes from being with, and a taste that, yes, those feelings are not lethal. And then it really takes off.
Yeah.
I don't, for me personally, I have had very few clients that are already in the flooded state. And that
Mhm.
might just be
Yeah.
me. I'm not sure. I will say, while I was writing this, I went to the Embody Labs Somatic Trauma Training Institute, and was like
Mhm.
around some of the real leaders of the trauma world. And it was very instrumental for me, because I was like, wow, the whole pulse of things, of this culture. And did you do the somatic program at CIS or no?
No, I had trained at the Strozzi
Right.
Institute and with Stacey Haynes and Denise Benson doing somatics and trauma, which became generative somatics.
Right. Yeah.
And
And so
yeah,
I had my own version too. So I didn't do it. So I don't actually like feel so steeped. I've probably had less somatic specific trauma training than you have. I do EMDR and whatnot. But I was like, wow, from what I can tell about this culture, they've become incredibly careful and cautious and just basically bringing people to the kind of sidelines of the pain. And it was striking to me and also instrumental. It really helped me make sure that there were enough permissions and like kind of instructions for people who weren't in a place to do this deep work, you
yeah.
know, in the book. I was glad I did it before I was done editing
Mhm.
because, I do think the majority of people who are picking up a book to learn how to feel they need help feeling, but it's a good reminder.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if
Mhm.
there's an overcautiousness,
It
almost like a CYA-ness in the field right now where it's like, are we trusting people that they can handle this?
Well, and I think it's important, and I remember that you mentioned something like that in the book, and I think it's a both and because the moments, and I can say that I have moved through extraordinary terror, like had to process that with another person, but also on my own.
Mhm.
And I'm at the point where like I might move through something, a witness, like a boyfriend that I was living with at the time, might be totally scared by what they
Uh-huh.
see. But I have an observer and I'm totally okay, even if I look like I am freaking out, like
Right,
internally, like my skin is on fire or something. And then it passes and it's
right.
totally fine. But that was because I built the trust. And so when you're working with complex PTSD, there is the need to go very slowly
Flow, right,
because
yeah,
that slow titration does build more trust. I think that
absolutely.
like if you're and again, like you said, it's like who's come to you, that's
Right,
what you know the most, right?
right, right,
And so it's not how I move with everybody. And is there
right.
no, it's like even something I'm thinking of an example. I had a client, like had my hand on their body doing body work years ago, like 20 years ago, and said something about like feel the ground rise up to meet you, or I don't know. It was just like the language. This is the tricky thing is when there's been
Mm,
extreme trauma, like
mhm.
ritual abuse, there's so much disorientation.
Yeah.
Like one moment can completely break trust or one word
Mm,
misuse of words. So I think
wow.
that's
Yeah.
what you're hearing is like there's a carefulness, but then you have to also, God, this is such a complex, we could do a whole
Yeah.
conversation just on this, and I'm aware of time. And so I want to give you time to say anything else that you want to say because we're going to need to sign out. But let's have this conversation
Okay.
separately
Yeah.
because yeah,
That's
I think it's a big one.
that's
Um,
great. Yeah. And
and yeah, go
it's
ahead.
so refreshing to have this conversation with you as an expert, because I'm doing a lot of interviews right now with people, and it's such a different dynamic to be with someone who is, you know, in it so deeply and in such a a population that's really suffering and dealing with some of the biggest kind of hurdles, of healing. The biggest feelings are the most numbness and all of this. It's like it's really an honor, and yeah, and I think you'd agree, right, that even those experiences are healable. It's like even those big feelings, even those
Yeah.
decades of numbness or deeply buried horrific trauma, like it's possible to heal. And obviously, that's you're living that, and an honor for me to be able to have this conversation with you specifically.
Thank you, Rachel. And so, how can people find you?
Yeah, everything I'm doing harkens back to your first question is housed at thefeelingsmovement.com. And feelings is plural. And we already said what the movement means. And I have a kind of DIY course that guides you through this process and a bunch of classes that you can, if you like to work kind of at your own pace through your own computer, but have a little version of me on it. There's all kinds of stuff there. I do retreats, but that will also connect you to the book, to my podcast, to my socials. So thefeelingsmovement.com.
Beautiful. So good to see you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. If you appreciated this episode, please like, rate, and review it and share with your friends. I'd really appreciate it. And if you'd like to stay connected, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at LaidOPEN Podcast. As well as if you go to charnacassell.com and join my newsletter, you'll receive up-and-coming announcements about courses, as well as resources and discounts. This has been LaidOPEN Podcast with your host, Charna Cassell. We all have different capacities, but I believe in our capacity to grow and change together. Until next time.